Number 10. The spring-heeled Jack panic. Some historical panics begin with disease, war, or visible violence. Others begin with sightings so strange that they seem to rupture the ordinary logic of the world. That is what made the spring-heeled Jack panic so powerful. Reports described a figure that did not behave like a normal criminal, prowler, or attacker. He was said to appear suddenly, terrify victims, and then escape in ways that felt almost inhuman, vaulting walls, leaping impossible distances, and turning darkness itself into part of the performance. The result was not just fear of a man. It was fear of something that seemed to move through the city outside the normal limits of the body. That distinction matters because communities are especially vulnerable to fear when the threat refuses to fit an existing category. A thief can be guarded against, a murderer can be hunted, but a figure who seems theatrical, elusive, and physically unnatural creates a different kind of dread. The imagination rushes in where explanation fails. Was he a prankster, a nobleman indulging cruelty, a gang invention, a demon, a monster? The uncertainty did not weaken the panic. It fed it. Every new report expanded the legend and made the figure feel less local and more invasive. What gave Spring-Heeled Jack such force was the urban setting. Modern cities are supposed to make danger visible through crowds, gaslight, police, and routine. Yet here was a panic built around the idea that something could erupt out of the city's edges and still remain uncaught. Dark streets, alleys, private gardens, carriage routes, walls, and rooftops all began to feel newly unstable. Ordinary movement at night became psychologically charged. The city was no longer simply a human space. It had become a stage for intrusion. And because the reports were sensational, the panic lived not only in direct encounters, but in repetition. Newspapers, rumor, gossip, retelling, and embellishment all played a role. A strange assault in one area could echo into another neighborhood as warning. A scream heard after dark could be interpreted through the legend immediately. Communities do not need universal proof to become frightened. They only need enough repeated narrative for expectation to reshape perception. Once people believed Spring-Heeled Jack might be real, every unexplained disturbance began serving the story. That is where the panic becomes more than folklore. It starts revealing something about collective dread in the 19th century itself. Society was modernizing, cities were expanding, and class anxieties, sensational journalism, and fascination with crime were all intensifying. Spring-Heeled Jack fit perfectly into that atmosphere because he seemed to unite old supernatural fear with modern urban instability. He was at once a demon from older imagination and a public menace moving through the new city. There is also something especially unsettling about the theatricality of the figure. He was not described as a silent, efficient killer. He was flamboyant, sudden, shocking. The performance mattered. That made every encounter feel less like random assault and more like deliberate violation of normal reality. Victims and witnesses were not merely reporting harm. They were reporting the sensation that the world had briefly stopped behaving correctly. And that feeling is one of the strongest engines any panic can have. In the end, the Spring-Heeled Jack panic belongs on this list because it shows how quickly a community can turn scattered terror into shared belief when the threat seems both real and impossible. Whether the figure was one man, several imitators, media amplification, or a legend feeding on itself, the effect was the same. Entire neighborhoods began acting as if something wicked was not just rumored, but actively moving among them after dark. Number 9. The Münster Anabaptist Kingdom. Some collective fears grow from rumors at the edges of society. The terror surrounding Münster became far more dangerous because it seized a real city and turned apocalyptic certainty into government. That is what makes this case so chilling. The community did not merely suspect evil had moved in. Many believed they were living inside the final struggle between divine truth and corrupt forces, and once that belief hardened, ordinary political life began to give way to something far more extreme. In the 1530s, Münster in present-day Germany became the center of a radical Anabaptist takeover during an age already burning with religious upheaval. The Reformation had shattered older certainties, authority was contested at every level, and Europe was full of people convinced that sacred history was accelerating toward a final confrontation. In such an atmosphere, fear did not need to look irrational to those experiencing it. It only needed to feel more urgent than the unstable world around them. That is what made Münster so combustible. The movement did not simply preach reform, it claimed divine legitimacy for total transformation. Once radical leaders and believers took control of the city, they did not treat dissent as ordinary disagreement. Dissent became rebellion against God's unfolding kingdom. And that shift changes everything. The moment a community believes evil is not merely outside the walls, but inside opposition itself, mercy, compromise, and ordinary social restraint begin collapsing fast. What followed was a city increasingly reorganized around apocalyptic certainty. Property, obedience, sexuality, punishment, and power all became subject to the new order. The community did not just fear an external enemy. It began policing itself through the conviction that the stakes were cosmic. Evil was not abstract. Evil was present in unbelief, resistance, hesitation, and any attachment to a world the movement believed was passing away. In that kind of environment, fear becomes total because it no longer belongs only to the vulnerable. It becomes a governing principle. And of course, outside observers saw Münster through their own terror as well. To surrounding powers, the city became proof of what religious fanaticism could do once unleashed. The result was a layered dread. Inside the city, people feared betrayal, judgment, and the enemies of God. Outside the city, rulers feared contagion, the possibility that this model of radical apocalyptic rule might spread. Münster ceased to be just one city. It became a symbol of evil fulfilled in social form. That symbolic power is why the case lingers so strongly in history. The kingdom did not last, but its fall only deepened its reputation. Siege, starvation, violence, and collapse gave later generations a narrative almost too perfect in its darkness. A community convinced it had become sacred, only to descend into coercion, paranoia, and ruin. Whether one frames the evil as fanaticism, delusion, tyranny, or spiritual corruption, the result is the same. People looked at Münster and saw not just error, but something terrifyingly contagious. In the end, the Münster Anabaptist kingdom belongs on this list because it reveals the most dangerous form of collective fear, the moment when a community stops imagining evil as an outside threat and begins building an entire order around the conviction that it alone stands against it. At that point, fear no longer simply distorts society, it governs it. Number 8. The Mattoon Mad Gasser Panic. Some historical fears begin with a visible body. A witch can be accused, a criminal can be chased, a cult leader can be named. The Mattoon Mad Gasser Panic was more disturbing because the threat seemed to move without a face. In 1944, in Mattoon, Illinois, residents began reporting strange, sweet odors, sudden weakness, paralysis, nausea, and the terrifying belief that an invisible attacker was entering homes under cover of night. The result was not just fear of crime. It was fear that something hostile could slip into private domestic space without being clearly seen at all. That is what gave the panic its force. A house is supposed to be the place where danger stops at the door. But in Mattoon, the home itself began to feel porous. Bedrooms, windows, porches, and nighttime routines all became charged with threat. The attacker, whether real, imagined, exaggerated, or socially constructed, did not need to be fully visible to dominate the town. In some ways, invisibility made the fear worse. A figure you can see belongs to the ordinary logic of danger. A force you can smell but not catch belongs to a more primitive category of dread. And because the panic centered on bodily symptoms, the fear traveled quickly. People did not just hear stories, they began scanning themselves for signs. A strange smell, dizziness, fatigue, nervousness, or a night noise could suddenly feel like evidence of attack. That is how community fear becomes self-reinforcing. The first cases create expectation. Expectation alters perception. Perception produces more cases. Soon the line between external threat and internal response becomes almost impossible for the community to separate. The wartime context matters too. The panic unfolded during World War II in an environment already shaped by anxiety, rumor, fatigue, and concern about sabotage or enemy action. That does not make the fear irrational in a dismissive sense. It makes it historically legible. Communities under stress are more ready to believe that something unnatural or malicious has entered ordinary life. Once a town imagines that a hidden assailant may be testing, poisoning, or targeting civilians, every unexplained experience begins fitting the pattern. What makes the Mattoon case especially powerful is that it sits right on the border between tangible and intangible fear. There were reports, witnesses, descriptions, and physical reactions, but there was no stable, fully captured villain to end the story. That ambiguity is exactly what allows panic to grow. A threat with no clear body becomes larger than a single offender. It becomes atmospheric. People stop fearing one intruder and begin fearing the possibility that the town itself has become vulnerable to something unseen. That is why the Mad Gasser legend endured. It offered a perfect container for several kinds of dread at once: invasion of the home, bodily helplessness, wartime suspicion, and the humiliating fact that even if the threat was not fully real in the literal way people imagined, the fear absolutely was. People locked doors, stayed awake, watched windows, and interpreted the dark through the logic of the gas attacker. The social effects were real regardless of the ultimate explanation. In the end, the Mattoon Mad Gasser panic belongs on this list because it shows how quickly an entire community can begin treating invisible threat as active evil once enough fear gathers around a few repeated signs. A smell, a weakness, a rumor, a sleepless night. These became enough to convince people that something malignant was moving through their town and into their homes. And once that happens, the absence of proof no longer brings comfort. It becomes part of the terror. Number 7. The War of the Ghost Dance. Some communities come to believe evil is real because they think it has entered from outside. The tragedy surrounding the ghost dance was darker because different communities saw radically different realities in the same movement. For many indigenous believers, the ghost dance was a spiritual response to catastrophe, a vision of renewal, restoration, and a world healed after conquest, loss, and destruction. But to US authorities and surrounding settlers, it began to look like something ominous, unstable, and potentially apocalyptic. Fear gathered around it until belief itself was treated as a threat. That is what makes the case so disturbing. The evil here was not only supernatural in the minds of participants or observers. It was political, racial, and interpretive. A movement grounded in prophecy and sacred hope became recoded by the dominant power as evidence of danger. Once that happened, spiritual practice was no longer seen as prayer or mourning. It was seen as possible uprising, fanaticism, or the opening stage of violence. The community's inner world became something outsiders imagined they had to stop before it fully arrived. The historical context is essential. Indigenous communities across the American West had already endured devastating displacement, military force, starvation, broken treaties, and cultural destruction. In that environment, the ghost dance did not emerge out of fantasy detached from reality. It emerged from unbearable historical trauma. It offered a spiritual language for survival, return, and the possibility that the dead might come back and the invader's world might pass away. To believers, that was hope. To authorities trained to fear anything outside their control, it looked like a dangerous reordering of reality. That gap in interpretation is where the fear became lethal. The more the movement spread, the more officials imagined that something uncontrollable was gathering. Dancers, songs, shirts, rituals, and prophecy all began to be read through the lens of threat. The US state did not need to believe literally in the movement's sacred claims to act as though something powerful and destabilizing was present. It only needed to believe that collective conviction itself was dangerous. And once a state begins treating belief as an emergency, violence is rarely far behind. This is why the case belongs on a list about communities thinking evil was real. Different sides were living inside different moral universes. Many indigenous communities saw sacred power, restoration, and defense against annihilation. Authorities saw mass delusion, insurgency, and something close to social possession. Fear filled the space between those interpretations. The result was not just misunderstanding. It was a historical collision in which collective spiritual energy became inseparable from collective dread. The culmination of that dread is what makes the story so heavy. The panic around the ghost dance contributed to escalating military pressure and the atmosphere that led to Wounded Knee. That fact is crucial because it shows the full power of communal fear. When enough people in authority decide that a movement is not merely strange but existentially threatening, they begin acting against it as though they are already fighting evil in material form. Belief becomes targetable. Ceremony becomes evidence. Hope itself becomes suspicious. In the end, the War of the Ghost Dance belongs here because it reveals one of history's darkest patterns. A community under devastation turns to spiritual meaning, and the outside world answers not with understanding, but with fear so intense it helps create catastrophe. Evil, in this case, was not only what people imagined in sacred terms. It was also what political power projected onto a people whose inner life it did not understand and refused to leave alone. Number 6. The Halifax Slasher Panic. Some community panics begin with an enemy no one can clearly identify. The Halifax Slasher Panic became terrifying because it seemed to offer both mystery and evidence at the same time. In 1938, people in Halifax, England began reporting attacks by an unseen assailant said to be carrying a knife or razor. Victims described torn clothing, cuts, shock, and sudden assault in public space. The story spread quickly, and with each new report, the town moved closer to the conviction that a violent predator was actively stalking ordinary people. That is what gave the panic its force. Public streets, alleys, and daily routines began to feel contaminated by threat. A slasher is not just a criminal in abstract terms. A slasher represents intimate, unpredictable bodily violation. The weapon is close. The attack is sudden. The victim may not even see the assailant clearly before the harm is done. Once a town starts believing such a figure is moving through its streets, normal movement changes immediately. People hurry home, crowds gather, suspicion expands. Every stranger begins to look newly significant. What makes Halifax especially revealing is how quickly the panic intensified once reports multiplied. A single case can be disturbing. Several cases clustered together become something else entirely. The community stops asking whether there is danger and begins asking how near it is. That shift matters because fear thrives on repetition more than certainty. The more people heard of attacks, the more ready they became to interpret marks, fright, torn fabric, or shock as proof that the slasher had struck again. The town was not merely reacting to incidents. It was building a narrative field in which more incidents became easier to generate. And that is where collective fear starts reshaping reality. Witness testimony becomes charged. Ambiguous injuries acquire sinister meaning. Rumors accelerate faster than verification. A person already anxious may experience an ordinary jostle, a snagged garment, or a sudden fright as attack. None of this means the panic was trivial. On the contrary, it shows how socially real fear can become even when the underlying events are unstable. People alter their lives, police mobilize, the press amplifies, and the town begins living inside the story, whether the threat is exactly what it seems or not. The Halifax case is also powerful because it exposes a familiar human need. Communities want evil to have a face. They would rather fear one monster than confront a messier truth involving rumor, suggestion, self-inflicted wounds, exaggerated reporting, or psychological contagion. A named attacker, however frightening, still belongs to the ordinary grammar of danger. But once evidence begins slipping, the community faces a worse possibility, that the panic itself may be moving through people faster than any single criminal could. That is one reason the slasher legend endured so strongly. It offered the ideal structure for fear. It was vivid, physical, local, and easy to imagine. A razor, a dark street, a sudden hand, a cry for help. The town could picture the evil clearly, even when it could not locate it. And once that image takes hold, the need for precision often weakens. The fear is already doing its work. In the end, the Halifax slasher panic belongs on this list because it shows how quickly communities can turn a series of alarming incidents into a shared conviction that something malevolent is actively moving among them. Whether the danger was one attacker, several incidents distorted by rumor, or a panic feeding on itself, the result was the same. Halifax began acting as though evil had taken to the streets and could cut into ordinary life at any moment. Number 5. The Dancing Plague of 1518, Few. Historical episodes feel more like a community encountering something evil in plain sight than the Dancing Plague of 1518. In Strasbourg, people began dancing in the streets in ways that appeared uncontrolled, compulsive, and terrifying. What makes the case so haunting is not only that the dancing spread, but that it seemed to resist ordinary human logic. This was not festival dancing, ritual celebration, or a brief outburst of madness that ended quickly. It appeared to continue against the will of those caught inside it, with exhaustion and collapse following where relief should have been. That is what gave the event its almost supernatural force. Movement is usually a sign of agency. Dancing is usually associated with joy, courtship, religion, or performance. But here, movement looked like possession. The body kept going while the self seemed to lose command. To witnesses living in a 16th century world already saturated with spiritual interpretation, that kind of outbreak could easily appear as punishment, curse, demonic interference, or some other direct rupture in the ordinary order of life. And because the phenomenon unfolded publicly, the fear became communal almost instantly. People were not hearing rumors about hidden evil. They were watching bodies behave in ways that seemed wrong in front of their eyes. That visibility matters. A private terror can be doubted. A public one recruits belief much faster. Once several people appear to be trapped inside the same impossible behavior, the event begins to feel larger than any single mind or body. The town starts asking not what is wrong with them, but what has entered us. What makes the dancing plague especially disturbing is the way authorities initially struggled to respond. When a threat cannot be clearly categorized, interventions may worsen the panic instead of containing it. The outbreak became not only a mystery of body and mind, but a crisis of interpretation. Was it medical, spiritual, social, environmental, punitive? In a world without stable modern categories for such an event, those around it had to act within fear before they could understand. That uncertainty gives the whole episode its strange historical electricity. The bodily spectacle also intensified the moral dread. Watching people dance beyond endurance does not simply produce curiosity. It produces the terrifying sense that the boundary between voluntary action and external force has been broken. The victim is still upright, still moving, still visibly alive, yet appears increasingly absent from their own motion. That image is one of the oldest building blocks of possession narratives. The body becomes public proof that something is no longer under ordinary control. There is also a deeper communal pressure here. In times of strain, hunger, instability, and religious fear, collective events can take on extraordinary meaning because they seem to gather diffuse anxiety into one visible form. The dancing plague may have had complex causes, but to the people within the event, complexity would have offered little comfort. They were living in a city where bodies themselves seemed to testify that the social and spiritual world had become unstable. Once that feeling sets in, people do not need a demon to be visible. They only need the conviction that invisible disorder is already acting through their neighbors. In the end, The Dancing Plague belongs at number 5 because it captures one of history's purest moments of communal dread. An entire city faced a spectacle that looked like movement without freedom, life without control, and suffering wearing the mask of dance. Whether one calls it mass psychogenic illness, social crisis made bodily, or something interpreted through the language of curse and possession, the emotional truth remains the same. To those who witnessed it, evil no longer seemed theoretical. It seemed to have entered the body itself. Number 4, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. Some collective outbreaks are terrifying because they involve violence. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic was frightening for the opposite reason. It looked harmless at first. Laughter is supposed to signal joy, relief, or human connection. But when laughter begins spreading through a community in ways that feel uncontrollable, prolonged, and deeply disruptive, it stops looking like happiness and starts looking like invasion. That is what made the epidemic so unsettling. Something associated with life and play seemed to detach from ordinary emotion and move through people like a force they could not easily resist. The outbreak began in 1962 in what is now Tanzania, reportedly starting among schoolgirls before spreading through wider social networks. Episodes of laughter could last far beyond what anyone would consider normal. People were not simply amused. They appeared caught in an involuntary loop that could include crying, agitation, exhaustion, and the collapse of everyday functioning. Schools were disrupted, communities were strained. The event spread across distance and time in ways that made it feel less like an incident and more like a social contagion. That is what gives the case its eerie power. A community can understand fear, illness, or attack in recognizable ways. But laughter that behaves like a plague destabilizes the emotional order itself. It suggests that the body and mind may no longer be reliable containers for feeling. Something that should be chosen or naturally arise becomes involuntary, excessive, and socially infectious. Once that happens, people are no longer only worried about those already affected. They begin wondering whether they themselves are next. And because the setting involved schools, authority, discipline, youth, and post-colonial social tension, the outbreak landed in a world already under pressure. That context matters. Collective phenomena do not emerge in a vacuum. They often draw force from stress, instability, expectation, and the emotional intensity of environments where people are closely watched and closely bound together. In such a setting, one person's loss of control can feel less like an isolated episode and more like the opening crack in a much larger structure. To the people living through it, the epidemic would not have felt like an abstract sociological puzzle. It would have felt intimate and destabilizing. A classroom becomes ungovernable. A child's face shifts from laughter to distress. Adults cannot easily restore order because the behavior does not respond to command in normal ways. The more people try to impose ordinary meaning on the event, the more its refusal seems active. It is not just occurring, it is spreading. That is why cases like this can so easily slide towards spiritual or moral interpretation. When behavior crosses the line between voluntary and involuntary in public view, communities often reach for the language of curse, possession, contamination, or evil influence. It is not simply that the people involved lacked scientific categories. It is that the experience itself feels morally and emotionally wrong. Laughter without joy, repetition without relief, spread without obvious cause, these are exactly the conditions that make invisible threat feel real. The epidemic also reveals something profound about communal fear. People do not need to believe literally in demons to feel they are confronting something beyond ordinary human control. Sometimes the shape of the event is enough. Once an outbreak resists explanation and begins reorganizing schools, households, and routines, the community starts living as if some hostile force has entered the social body. It may not have a name, it may not have a visible face, but it behaves like presence. In the end, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic belongs on this list because it shows how even a human expression associated with joy can become terrifying once it detaches from intention and begins moving through a community like a contagion. To later observers, it may invite explanation. To those inside it, it must have felt far more immediate, as though the body had stopped obeying familiar rules and something strange had begun speaking through laughter itself. Number 3. The Great Fear in Revolutionary France. Some communities think evil is real because they believe they have seen a monster, a demon, or a supernatural sign. The Great Fear in Revolutionary France was darker because the evil people feared was social, political, and everywhere at once. In 1789, as old structures of authority trembled and rumour moved faster than certainty, peasants across parts of France began hearing terrifying stories of brigands, conspiracies, aristocratic plots, and organised attacks supposedly moving toward them. The result was a wave of panic so intense that entire communities armed themselves, mobilised defensively, and acted as though the kingdom were under invasion from an invisible network of enemies. That is what makes the Great Fear so powerful. The danger was not concentrated in one body or place. It was atmospheric. Villages heard that armed bands were coming. Others heard that nobles were hiring criminals to burn crops, starve peasants, or punish unrest. Messages arrived half-formed, exaggerated, contradictory, and urgent. But in moments of revolutionary instability, precision matters less than momentum. The rumour of evil becomes more important than its verification because the community feels it cannot afford to wait. And once that happens, ordinary life reorganizes almost instantly. Farmers become guards, neighbours become sentries, roads, fields, churches, and manor houses begin to look different under the pressure of anticipation. A rider on the horizon may no longer be a traveller, a distant fire may no longer be accidental, a stranger may no longer be neutral. Fear takes hold not only because people believe something is coming, but because they start experiencing the whole landscape as a field of possible attack. The revolutionary context made this even more explosive. France was already filled with uncertainty, hunger, resentment, collapsing legitimacy, and the sense that history had become unstable. In such a world, rumours of elite conspiracy did not feel absurd. They felt plausible. The old order had long been experienced as oppressive, so the idea that it might retaliate through hidden violence fit emotional expectations even when evidence was weak or shifting. The fear was not irrational in the sense of being detached from all reality. It was built out of a society where trust had already broken down. That is what gives the Great Fear its distinct place on this list. Evil did not have to arrive wearing supernatural language. It arrived as conspiracy, hidden intent, and the suspicion that powerful people were willing to destroy ordinary communities to preserve control. When enough villagers believed that at once, rumour became social fact. Even if the brigands were not there in the way people imagined, the fear of them produced real mobilization, real attacks, and real transformation. And transformation is the crucial point. Collective fear rarely stays passive. Once communities arm themselves and begin acting under the belief that hostile forces are moving against them, panic can turn into political consequence. Manor records were attacked, seigneurial symbols were targeted, and revolutionary momentum deepened. Fear did not merely reflect the revolution, it helped accelerate it. That is one of the darkest features of communal dread. Even when the immediate object of fear is unstable, the actions taken in response can permanently alter history. There is also something uniquely chilling about how impersonal the threat felt. A witch trial gives the community a body to accuse. A possession panic gives it a visible victim. The Great Fear gave communities something more difficult, a hostile system imagined as already in motion but never fully grasped. That kind of danger is especially corrosive because it turns everyone into a potential messenger and every rumor into a possible warning. Society begins listening to itself with panic. In the end, the Great Fear belongs near the top of this list because it reveals how entire populations can come to experience hidden malice as a living force once trust, hierarchy, and information all begin to collapse together. To the people inside it, evil was not abstract. It was already on the road, already in the fields, already moving through rumor faster than anyone could verify. And once they believed that, France itself began to change under the pressure of the fear. Number 2. The Loudun possessions. Some communities think evil is real because of rumors in the street. Loudun became terrifying because evil seemed to take hold inside a convent, in the bodies and voices of women who were supposed to belong to one of the most disciplined spiritual spaces in society. That is what made the Loudun possession so powerful. A convent is meant to represent order, devotion, enclosure, and protection from worldly corruption. But in 17th century Loudun, that enclosure began to look less like safety and more like a sealed chamber where something hostile had moved in. The case became infamous when Ursuline nuns began displaying behaviors interpreted as demonic possession, convulsions, accusations, altered voices, blasphemous speech, and physical agitation that observers read through the religious logic of the time. Once those signs appeared, the convent stopped being a private religious institution and became a public theatre of evil. Clergy, authorities, townspeople, and political interests all gathered around the event, each bringing their own expectations about what demons, temptation, heresy, and corruption were supposed to look like. That is where the fear expanded beyond the convent walls. The possessions did not remain a local mystery of distressed individuals. They were turned into a larger narrative about spiritual contamination, hidden sin, and the presence of malevolent forces inside the moral heart of the community. And because the accused source of the evil could be personified in the figure of Urbain Grandier, the panic acquired exactly what communities often want most: a human body to carry the blame. Once that happened, the invisible threat became prosecutable. What makes Loudun especially disturbing is that it sits at the intersection of religion, politics, sexuality, and spectacle. Possession was not simply a matter of private belief. It became a public event shaped by power. Exorcisms were watched. Testimony was given. The suffering and behavior of the nuns were interpreted within a social environment already primed to connect spiritual disorder with moral scandal. The community did not just witness fear, it organized itself around it. That is why Loudun belongs so high on this list. The event reveals how quickly belief in evil can transform a crisis of behavior into a total social drama. The possessed are no longer only afflicted, they become evidence. The priest or outsider accused of causing the disorder becomes more than a suspect. He becomes the answer to the unbearable question of why sacred space has become unstable. And once a community believes it has found the source of evil, the appetite for restraint weakens fast. There is also something uniquely haunting about the setting. A convent is already a space of silence, discipline, repression, ritual, and intense spiritual expectation. When strange behavior erupts there, the contrast is overwhelming. Every scream feels louder, every convulsion feels more blasphemous, every accusation feels like proof that unseen forces have crossed a boundary that should have held. Evil does not merely seem present, it seems to have invaded the very place built to keep it out. And in the end, that is what made Loudun so historically potent. Whether one interprets the events through religion, psychology, coercion, political manipulation, or social contagion, the emotional truth remains the same. An entire community came to believe that demonic corruption had become real in their midst. Once that belief hardened, the convent ceased to be a place of prayer alone. It became a machine for producing fear, accusation, and punishment. Number 1. The Salem witch trials. Few events capture communal belief in real evil more completely than Salem. That is why it stands at number 1. This was not just a handful of frightened people sharing rumors in private. It was a whole social world beginning to behave as though witchcraft was active, immediate, and woven into daily life. Neighbors accused neighbors. Spectral evidence entered proceedings. Ordinary tensions hardened into mortal danger. And once the fear took hold, the invisible world stopped being an abstract theological concern. It became a living threat believed to be operating inside the village itself. What made Salem so terrifying was the intimacy of the suspected evil. The devil was not imagined as a distant power acting through obvious monsters. He was believed to be working through familiar people. That transforms fear completely. A stranger can be watched from a distance, but when evil is thought to move through neighbors, servants, family lines, and respected members of the community, the entire social fabric becomes unstable. Trust begins rotting from within. The broader context mattered enormously. Salem existed in a world shaped by Puritan theology, frontier anxiety, political uncertainty, factional tension, and a serious belief in the reality of spiritual warfare. For the people inside that world, witchcraft was not fantasy. It was a category of danger as real as disease or attack. That does not excuse what followed, but it explains the intensity. Once strange fits, accusations, and fearful testimony appeared, the culture already possessed a complete framework for interpreting them as signs that evil had entered the community in organized form. That framework is what allowed the trials to escalate so quickly. The afflicted were treated as witnesses to invisible assault. The accused were not merely unpopular individuals. They became possible agents of a hidden conspiracy against godly order. The court system itself became involved in sorting spiritual threat from innocence, which gave the panic official structure. Fear no longer belonged only to private belief. It became legal process, public testimony, imprisonment, and death. What makes Salem especially dark is how efficiently the community converted uncertainty into certainty. Fits that might have remained ambiguous became proof. Personal grievances acquired cosmic meaning. Religious seriousness blended with fear until hesitation itself could look suspicious. Once a society accepts that evil is both unseen and active, evidence becomes dangerously flexible. The need to identify the threat outruns the ability to prove it cleanly. That is one of the central horrors of Salem. The system did not fail despite belief in evil. It failed through the very seriousness with which that belief was enforced. And because the accused came from within the community, Salem turned ordinary life into a field of dread. A quarrel, a glance, an illness, a child's behavior, a failed crop, a social slight. Any of these could be pulled into the logic of witchcraft once fear had matured enough. The village was no longer simply dealing with misfortune. It was reading misfortune as coordinated malice. The result was a society listening to itself with paranoia. That is why Salem remains the clearest example for this video. It shows what happens when a community does not merely fear evil in principle, but becomes convinced that evil has already gained local agents and must be rooted out through accusation. At that point, the moral danger is no longer only the imagined witchcraft. It is the structure of fear itself. The hunt becomes its own evil. In the end, the Salem witch trials stand at number one because they reveal the most complete form of collective dread. A community so certain that hidden evil is real that it reorganizes law, religion, testimony, and daily trust around the need to destroy it. The devil did not need to appear in visible form. Belief alone was enough to make neighbors into threats and suspicion into death.